The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the last week of March, when the cottage eaves still dripped with the last remnants of winter ice, and the lane outside lay thick with mud, the colour of old pewter. The postboy left it on the windowsill without waiting for a reply. Theodora recognized her father's handwriting before she had even crossed the room to touch it. Those careful, cramped loops, the ink pressed dark at the beginning of every word and trailing thin by its end, as though everything he wrote cost him something, and he spent less of it as he went. She read it standing, still in her morning gown, with the fire behind her not yet properly caught. "My dear Theodora, I am not well. The physician says I have perhaps 6 weeks, perhaps less if the cold does not break. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know what I made you give up, and I know what became of it. But you are my daughter, and I am afraid, and I would very much like to see your face before the end. Come home if you are willing. Pemberton Hall is still yours, whatever else they have taken from you. Your father, Arthur." She set the letter down. Outside the window, 2 rooks were disputing a crust of bread on the stone garden wall, and somewhere in the lane, a cartwheel ground against frozen mud. She picked the letter up and read it from the beginning. Then once more. "I know what I made you give up." 4 words. 4 words in 30 years of a relationship conducted almost entirely in practical terms, in the language of arrangements and expectations, of what was sensible and what was not. He had never spoken them before, not in the 3 years since her engagement to the Duke of Rain, not in the 2 years of her marriage, not in the 6 terrible months since the Duke had died, and his brother's solicitors had arrived at Rain House with their documents, and their carefully neutral expressions, and their lists of everything that was no longer hers. She stood at the window for a long while after the second reading. The rooks had settled their dispute, the fire behind her had at last decided to catch, and the smell of pine and warm ash began to fill the small parlour. I told myself I did not have to go. I told myself I owed my father nothing beyond what common decency required, that the arrangement he had made for my life, the one that traded me for the settling of a family debt and called it an advantageous match, that none of it required one more thing from me than it had already taken. I told myself that very carefully every morning over my tea. And then on the 3rd morning I remembered that word he had written, afraid, and I went to find Helena and told her to begin packing. There are stories the world tells about women who return home. This one begins in the spring of 1814, in the country house of an English earl who is dying and has begun at last to tell the truth. At the centre of it is a woman who was given away in exchange for the settlement of her father's debts, who lived 2 years in a house that never became hers, and who came back 3 months after losing even that to find a silence she had not expected, and a man who had not left. It is not a simple story. The house is full of old grief and older silences, and the man she returns to has spent 5 years learning to want very little, and to endure most of what came in place of what he wanted. But her father is dying, and has begun to speak plainly, and sometimes all it takes for everything to change is one person deciding, too late and also not too late at all, to finally say what they know. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Are you in your sitting room, in bed, or somewhere between one life and another? I want to know. I read every single one. The hired carriage departed the cottage at 7:30 on the first morning of April. Theodora did not consider this an omen, which required a degree of deliberate effort. Helena sat across from her, with the hat-box balanced on her knees, and an expression that was perfectly composed in the specific way that signified very strong opinions being heroically withheld. 6 years of service had made Helena's silences legible to Theodora, in the manner that weather is legible to a farmer, a matter of knowing which direction to look and what the particular quality of the light was indicating. "You may speak it," Theodora said. "I have not spoken anything. You are thinking something loudly." "I was thinking," Helena said, "that you have not eaten since yesterday noon." "That is not what you were thinking. It is what I am prepared to say." The countryside through the window was doing what the English countryside does in early April, making extravagant promises of spring, and delivering, in the main, grey sky and mud, with narrow consolation in the occasional flare of yellow gorse along the stone walls. Theodora watched it pass and thought about the last time she had made this journey in the opposite direction. 18 months ago. She and the Duke of Rain in his private carriage, the velvet curtains drawn against the summer dust, the silence between them as comfortable as it ever became, which was to say, not greatly. The Duke had been a decent man. She reminded herself of this regularly, particularly since his death, because he had not deserved her quiet bewilderment at finding herself married to him, and bewilderment at least was not unkindness. He had been decent and rather distant, and mildly puzzled by her from the first month. She had been 23 and obedient, and mildly puzzled by everything. They had managed adequately, as these arrangements sometimes did. What she had never managed was to stop thinking of what she had walked away from when she said yes to him. She pressed her gloved fingers together in her lap and returned her gaze to the gorse. Pemberton Hall lay in a fold of the Wiltshire Hills, 2 miles from the village of Ashton Cross, surrounded by beech woods older than the house itself. Her father had always treated those trees with a reverence he extended to very few living things. Theodora had grown up among them, had read under their canopy in summer, gathered their bronze leaves in autumn, watched frost trace the pattern of their bare branches from the schoolroom window on winter mornings. She had been happy there, in the simple and uncomplicated way of someone who has not yet learned what happiness costs. The carriage turned off the main road at midday, onto the lane that ran between Ashton Cross and the Hall gates. The road surface improved immediately. The estate lanes were well maintained, always had been, and the fact of it settled in her chest in a way she chose not to examine. She had not permitted herself to think directly about Nathaniel. She had been strict with herself on this point across the 2 days of packing and the morning of departure. She had thought about her father's illness and the household arrangements, and whether Mrs. Goodall was still housekeeper, and which rooms would need to be readied. She had been very thorough. She had not thought about Nathaniel. He would not still be there. She had told herself this as well. He had been offered a position in Northumberland. Her father had mentioned it in a letter 2 years ago, in the approving manner of someone sharing news he expected to be received as satisfactory, as though informing her that a thing she had not spoken of in 3 years was going far away and staying there. She had read that letter 3 times, and then placed it in the grate. The carriage slowed as it approached the gates. She looked up without meaning to. The gates stood open, and just inside them, speaking to the gatekeeper's boy with a roll of plans under one arm and a coat that needed pressing, but a bearing that had not noticed, was Nathaniel Castelaine. He had not gone to Northumberland. Theodora went very still. He had not seen her yet. The carriage was approaching from his left, and his attention was bent over the plans he was unrolling to show the boy, dark head inclined, one hand braced against the stone gatepost, the other holding down a corner of paper against the April wind. He was thinner than she remembered. There was grey at his temples that had not been there 5 years ago. She registered these changes in the space between one breath and the next, and they did something to whatever she had spent 3 weeks building in the way of steadiness. The carriage wheels crunched louder on the gravel. He looked up. For one moment, no more than a second, perhaps less, his face was entirely unguarded. She saw the stillness move through him, the quality of controlled surprise settling into something else, something more careful. His eyes found hers through the carriage window, dark amber in the pale spring light, and he held her gaze without flinching, and the carriage continued its slow progress through the gate and up the drive. She did not turn around as it passed him. "Your hands," Helena said quietly, in the tone she used for observations that were not actually observations. Theodora looked down. She had pressed her gloved fingers together so firmly the knuckles had whitened through the fabric. She released them. She folded her hands in her lap with care and straightened her back and looked forward at the house emerging at the end of the elm-lined avenue. Pemberton Hall, grey stone and many-windowed, with the old rose beds dormant along the south wall and the beech woods rising gold and bare behind it, and a thread of smoke from the western chimneys that meant the fire in her father's study had been lit. She had not seen it in 3 years. It looked precisely as she remembered. It looked like something she had not known she was still keeping. Mrs. Goodall met her at the door, still housekeeper then, which was a small and reliable mercy. The household received her with the careful warmth of people who had not been given clear instructions and were defaulting to correctness. Theodora said the right things. She went inside. Behind her at the gate, Nathaniel Castellane was rolling his plans back up. Her father had moved himself into the east bedroom after her mother died, 9 years ago. Theodora had always found this quietly remarkable, that he had chosen to inhabit the room where his wife had lived and slept for 30 years, rather than the room where she had died, which was a distinction she had never felt able to ask him about. The east bedroom caught more light than most rooms in the hall, and perhaps that was the whole of it, or perhaps not. Dr. Finch met her in the corridor outside. He was a small, deliberate man with the steady manner of someone accustomed to delivering information that people did not wish to receive, and kind eyes that suggested he had never quite made peace with the necessity. "He has been asking for you since yesterday," Dr. Finch said. "He slept this morning, which was welcome. His lungs are the primary concern. The weakness is pervasive and the cold is not helping. He tires quickly and must not be agitated." "I will not agitate him," Theodora said. "No," Dr. Finch agreed, in a tone that was not quite agreement so much as reserved judgment maintained with professional grace. She knocked before entering. She had not done this as a child. Her father's voice came through the door, thinner than she was prepared for, but still unmistakably his. The room was warm in the way of rooms kept warmer than the occupant probably requires, with a fire built too high, and the curtains half drawn against the afternoon draughts. It smelled of lavender water and wintergreen, and the particular dry closeness of a long sick room. Her father lay propped on 3 pillows in the large bed, and what she had not prepared herself for, what she could not have prepared herself for, was how small he had become. He had never been a tall man, but he had been substantial in the way of men who fill a room not by their size, but by the weight of their attention. That attention was still in his eyes, which were the same pale sage green she found in her own reflection each morning, and they fixed on her now with something she had not anticipated. He looked relieved. She had expected coolness, or the formal distance that had been the medium of their relationship for most of her adult life. She had not expected relief, plain and undisguised, spreading across his face the moment she came through the door. "Theodora." He said it the way he had said it when she was 8 years old and had spent an afternoon lost in the beech wood. Simply her name, as though naming her was sufficient. She crossed the room and took the chair beside the bed. She did not speak immediately, because she did not trust what she might say, and her father had always understood her silences. "You look well," he said. "You do not," she said. "But I am glad to see you." He made a short sound that was almost a laugh. Blunt as ever. "I learned it somewhere." He studied her in the quiet way that had always made her feel carefully read, as though he could see past the composed surface she presented to the world. She had spent most of her adolescence finding this quality infuriating. Sitting beside him now, she found it unexpectedly tender. "I was not sure you would come," he said. "You said you were afraid." Something moved across his face. He turned to look at the curtained window. "Yes, I wrote that." "You have never said that to me before." "No." A pause, the length of 3 slow breaths. "I have been ungenerous with words that cost anything. With you, specifically." The fire settled in the grate. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the 1/4 hour with its small, measured note. "I arranged your marriage," he said to the window, "without consulting your heart. I told myself it was practical necessity, that you were young and sensible and would accommodate yourself to it, that what felt like feeling at your age was not the same as what was lasting." He looked back at her. His pale green eyes were exhausted and steady. "I was wrong about that, and I was a coward about it. I have had 3 years to sit with both facts, and I find that is both too long and entirely insufficient." Theodora was very still. Outside, the April wind was picking up through the curtain gap, the sky pressing down with the particular grey of English late afternoon. "What is it you want from me?" she said at last. It was not a refusal. It was an honest question. "To stay," he said. "Until the end, if you can bear it. And perhaps—" He paused, and she heard the effort the pause cost him. "Perhaps to consider whether what you left behind here has kept." She did not pretend not to understand him. She had always disliked the particular dishonesty of pretending not to understand a thing one understood perfectly well. "I have not had occasion to think clearly about anything for some time," she said. "I will try to begin now." "That is enough," her father said. "That is considerably more than enough." He slept within 20 minutes, the sleep of the genuinely exhausted, sudden and heavy. She sat beside him for a while longer, listening to his careful, shallow breathing, and to the fire and to somewhere below her in the house, a door closing with a sound she paid more attention to than she should have. Then she rose and straightened her skirts and went downstairs to find out what needed doing. Nathaniel had not sought her out, and she had not sought him, and this maintained itself through the whole of the first evening with a degree of effort on both sides that was probably visible to the household and certainly to Helena, who said nothing about it at all, which was its own form of comment. The morning after her arrival, Theodora came down to the breakfast room at 8:30 to find a neat stack of papers on the table beside the coffee service and Nathaniel standing at the window with his back to the door. He turned when she came in. He was not a man who startled easily. She had always known this about him, had always found it one of the more steadying things in his vicinity, that quality of already being still, of not requiring the world to slow down for him because he had already arrived at the pace of it. "Good morning, Lady Theodora," he said. The title landed strangely. She had been Lady Theodora all her life, daughter of an earl first, then wife of a duke, and she had never heard it sound quite the way it did in his voice this morning. Correct and precise and somehow careful, like a hand held deliberately at one side. "Good morning, Mr. Castellane," she said, which was no different, which was equally deliberate, and they both of them knew it. She sat down. She poured her coffee. He waited by the window, and she could see from the angle of his shoulders that he had something prepared to say and was deciding whether this was the right moment for it. She recognized this in him from 5 years of knowing his habits. He thought before he spoke, always. It had been one of the first things she had noticed about him. "I have prepared a summary of the estate's position," he said. "When you are ready." "I am ready now." He brought the papers to the table and sat across from her and walked her through 3 years of management in the steady, economical manner that was his way with information. Nothing embellished, nothing withheld, each thing given in its proper order and proportion. The estate had run at a modest deficit for the first year after her marriage, owing to a poor harvest and the delayed repair of the mill on the east side of the property, which had been neglected beyond its capacity for patience. He had renegotiated the tenant rents in the second year, and the deficit had cleared. The third year had been better. The beechwoods were healthy. The home farm was adequately stocked. The kitchen gardens had been extended, which was producing a better return than expected. Theodora listened. She asked questions, specific ones about the terms of the mill repair and the rate of the renegotiated rents, and he answered them without any suggestion of surprise at her knowing what to ask. She had grown up in this house. She had always paid attention to how it was kept. He had been the one she paid most attention to. She did not let herself look at him for longer than was required to follow the papers he pointed to. It was the same room, the same table, the same particular slant of April morning light through the east-facing windows, and across the table was the same man who had once explained to her the rotation of the home farm crops, on a morning very like this one. She had been 20 years old, and had sat very carefully on the opposite side of the table, because even then she had understood the architecture of what was happening between them, and had understood also that she was not yet able to trust herself within it. "The eastern cottages need repointing," he said, "before the autumn. I had identified the funds, but wanted your approval before committing them." "You have had the management of this estate for 3 years," she said. "You have not needed my approval." "No," he said, "but it is your estate." She looked up. The quality of the quiet between them changed, the way a room's temperature changes when a window is opened without announcement. His eyes were steady on her, that dark amber that had always had the disconcerting quality of not looking away, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something further, something that lay behind the practical conversation they were conducting. Then he looked down at the papers. "You have approval on the repointing," she said, "and on anything else that requires it. I intend to be useful while I am here." "I had no doubt of that," he said, and she could not quite read the register of it, whether it was simply agreement or something else that had borrowed agreement's words for the occasion. She gathered the papers after he left and took them to her mother's sitting room, which she had been given for her own use during the visit. She sat with them for an hour, going through the details, making notes, and doing her best not to think about the particular quality of his voice on "I had no doubt of that," which had lodged itself with considerable precision in a place she was attempting to keep orderly. The estate was well managed. Better than well managed. It was cared for in the way that only happens when the person responsible for something has made a genuine and private decision to take it seriously, not as an obligation, but as a trust. She had spent the last 3 years in a house managed with cold efficiency. She had forgotten what it felt like to see a house that was actually loved. That evening she sat with her father for an hour before supper and told him the estate was in good order, and watched something ease in his face that had not been easy in a long time. She found herself in the quiet garden on the second afternoon. It was not precisely a decision, more a drift, the way one sometimes moves through a house towards a particular room, not because one has chosen to go there, but because the body holds memories the mind has not fully catalogued. The kitchen garden was brown and patchy with the season, only the earliest herbs showing any green, and those cautiously, as though spring was an offer they had not yet decided to trust. Beyond it, the rose beds along the south wall were thorned and dormant but tidily pruned, and beyond those the old gate in the east wall stood slightly ajar. She had not intended to go through it. She went through it. The garden on the other side of the wall was what her mother had called the quiet garden, a small enclosed space, perhaps 40 feet by 40, with a stone bench along the inner wall and a fig tree at the center that was older than anyone living and which flowered every year with a reliability that her mother had once described as the only truly dependable thing about the hall. In summer, it was overgrown and warm and smelled of sun on old stone. In April, it was bare and grey and rather beautiful, in the way of places stripped back to their architecture. She had last stood in this garden in the autumn of 1811. She had been 20 years old, and Nathaniel had been 27, and they had been debating with a false casualness that fooled neither of them, whether a certain passage in a French novel she had lent him was correctly translated. The argument had not been about the translation. She had known that. He had known that. They had stood 3 feet apart beside the fig tree in the October cold, and he had looked at her with those amber eyes in the particular way that made her feel she was being seen precisely and completely, and she had thought clearly and with absolute certainty, "I could love this man for my whole life." 3 weeks later, her father had called her into his study and told her that the 8th Duke of Rain had expressed an interest in a formal introduction. She sat down on the stone bench now in the April of 1814 and was very still for a moment. The fig tree was putting out the very earliest buds, small and curled and tentative, a pale greenish yellow against the grey bark. A blackbird was working through last year's leaves at the base of the wall, turning each one over with a focused efficiency, she found for no clear reason, comforting. She did not hear him come through the gate. She became aware of him the way one becomes aware of a change in the light, not a single moment, but a gradual realization that the quality of the air around her had altered. Nathaniel stopped just inside the gate. He had not expected her there. She could see this, and she appreciated that he did not pretend otherwise. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not know you were here. I was checking the fig." "Every year at this point in the season?" A pause. "Every year." "Then come and check it," she said. "I am not in the way of that." He came forward. He crouched beside the tree and examined the emerging buds with the careful attention he gave to everything on this estate, not performing interest but genuinely having it. She watched him and felt the old familiar ache of it, the particular quality of pain that belongs to things one has not let oneself think about for a very long time. "She used to say it was the most dependable thing about the hall," Theodora said. He looked up. He knew she meant her mother. "She was right," he said. "It has never once failed. Everything else has managed it at least once." He was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened and stood and looked at the tree rather than at her. "Lady Theodora, I want to say, What happened after the Duke's death? The manner of it. I heard, and I wanted you to know that I considered writing. I decided against it. I know, she said. I think I would have preferred the letter. He looked at her then. The afternoon light was flat and even, and it showed everything. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the grey at his temples, the steadiness of his gaze that had never, not once in 5 years of knowing each other, felt like the absence of feeling, but always like the presence of very great feeling, held very carefully. I did not know what I could say, he said, that would not presume too much. You could have said that you were sorry. I was. A pause. I am. She looked at the fig tree. The buds were very small and very determined. She thought of all the things that survive winters by not flowering when it is not yet safe. I think we should not talk about any of this yet, she said. My father is ill, and I have barely arrived, and there are things I need to understand before I know what I want to say. Of course, he said, immediate and with no visible hurt, which she thought was either very controlled or genuinely gracious, and which she could not yet tell apart. He left through the gate. She stayed on the bench until the blackbird had worked its way to the far end of the wall and gone over it. Her father had more to say than she expected. On the third morning of her visit, while Dr. Finch had gone to attend a patient in the village, and the house was quiet in the particular way of mid-morning, Arthur Pemberton asked Helena to leave them alone, and then asked Theodora to close the door. I need to tell you something, he said, that I should have told you before your engagement. She settled her hands in her lap. All right. He took a breath, and she could hear the effort in it, the reluctant working of lungs that were no longer reliable. The estate was in difficulty 3 years before I approached the Rain family. I had managed it badly in the years after your mother's death, not through negligence, you understand, but through a form of inattention that amounts to the same thing. I was not attending to the right things. By 1809 we were carrying a debt I did not know how to retire without a sale, and I would not sell. Your grandfather built this house. Your mother died here. I would not sell it. Theodora did not speak. She watched her father's face. The Rain family approached me, he said. Not the other way. They were looking for a connection that would lend the Rain title a degree of social credibility. The current Duke's father had made some investments that bore badly, and there was a degree of public awareness of it. They wanted the Pemberton name, and I wanted the settlement they were offering. He paused. I want to be precise about this. I used you. I told myself it was an honorable match, and that you would be well provided for, and you were. But it was a transaction, and I understood it as one, and I never gave you the information that would have allowed you to make an informed choice. The morning light was pale and steady through the gap in the curtains. The fire had been built low. Somewhere in the garden, a wood pigeon was going on at itself with great persistence. Did you know about Nathaniel? She said. Her father closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Before the engagement or after? Before. She received this. She set it down somewhere in herself and did not look at it directly yet. And still you went ahead. And still I went ahead. He opened his eyes. The sage green of them was very tired. I told myself that what existed between you and Castellane was impractical, that he was a steward, that a marriage between you was impossible, that what you felt was the attachment of propinquity, rather than anything that would sustain a life. I told myself all of that with great thoroughness, and I wonder now whether I believed any of it, or whether I simply found it convenient to believe. What do you believe now? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the pigeon had given up and gone somewhere else. I believe, he said slowly, that I sacrificed something real and irreplaceable for the sake of something that turned out to be less important than I thought, and I believe I have no right to ask you to forgive that, but I am asking you anyway, which is cowardice of a different order. Theodora sat with this for a long time, the length of several slow breaths, the length of the fire crackling through a small knot in the wood, the length of whatever it was moving through her chest, not anger, not any longer, or not only anger. Something more complicated, the feeling of someone showing you a map of a room you have been walking through in the dark, too late to have been useful, but not too late to be clarifying. I am not going to forgive you today, she said. It would not be honest to do it today. I know, but I think I understand better what happened. And I think that matters. He nodded. His eyes were very bright. Castellane should have had the chance to speak, he said, before any of it. I never gave him that. No. She looked at her hands. He is still here. He has always been here. A pause, and then, with a quietness that cost him something. I did not think that was coincidence. She said nothing. There was nothing to say to that which she was ready to say in this room on this morning, with her father's breathing so careful and her own heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. She rose and pressed his hand gently, and he held it briefly with the unfamiliarity of a man who did not have much practice at this, and then released it. Rest, she said. I will be back this afternoon. She went out. In the corridor she stood for a moment with her back against the door, in the cool dim light, and breathed. He has always been here. She had known that, of course. She had known it the moment she saw him at the gate. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and being told it plainly by the person responsible for the original loss, and the difference was doing something to the structure she had been trying to maintain. She straightened. She went downstairs. She found things to do because that was what she was good at, and because the alternative at present was sitting very still with a feeling she was not yet prepared to name. It rained on the fourth day, the sort of long, grey, purposeful April rain that did not intend to stop before evening, and which turned the estate roads to channels and rendered outdoor work entirely impractical. Theodora spent the morning with her father and the afternoon in the library, working through the correspondence that had accumulated during the weeks when no one of the household had felt certain what decisions were properly theirs to make. She had been there perhaps an hour, with the fire going well and the rain doing its steady business against the tall windows, when Nathaniel knocked and came in. He had, she gathered, been making use of the same library for some time. He came to the far side of the table without apparent self-consciousness, produced his own papers from the leather case he carried, and sat down. Then he looked up. I can work elsewhere, he said. So can I, she said. Neither of us needs to. He settled in and they worked. The rain continued. The fire did its quiet, useful work. The library smelled of leather and beeswax and a faintly damp wool coming from somewhere near Nathaniel, which she was not going to think about. The estate correspondence required more attention than she had expected. Several letters from tenant farmers, 2 from the solicitor in the village regarding a disputed right-of-way that had been unresolved for 11 months, 1 from a timber merchant in Bath who was attempting to renegotiate a standing contract. She dealt with them methodically, drafting replies in a hand she had been trained to keep legible and plain, and finding a quiet and very specific satisfaction in the work that she had not felt in a long time. The Rain household had not included her in its management. The Duchess of Rain had been a figure of decorative social utility, positioned attractively at dinners and consulted on nothing of substance. She had made her peace with it, because making her peace with things was what she did. She saw clearly now that she should not have. The timber merchant, she said, without looking up from the letter. He wants a reduction on the contract for the next supply. I am going to tell him no. I was going to tell him the same, Nathaniel said, also without looking up. He has asked 3 times in 2 years. The answer is the same each time. He will try again in 6 months. Without doubt. Good. She made a note and moved to the next letter. Beside her the fire snapped and resettled, and the rain drove in a harder gust against the glass, and the quality of the silence between them, which had been all afternoon a careful working silence, 2 people concentrating in the same room, shifted almost imperceptibly. You have done this before, Nathaniel said. Estate correspondence. I grew up watching my father do it. You do it better than he did, he said, or did at that age. She looked up then. He was watching her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but had some of its quality, warmth managed into something more contained, a kind of regard that was so familiar to her that seeing it felt like putting on a coat she had mislaid. You should not say things like that, she said. No, he agreed. Probably not. He looked back at his papers. She looked back at hers. The rain had settled into a steady, even fall, Somewhere outside, a gutter was not coping well with the volume of water, producing a complicated percussion against the stones below. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The position in Northumberland. You were offered it twice. I know because my father mentioned it." A pause. "I was offered it twice." "Why did you not take it?" The fire crackled. He was quiet for the length of several small sounds, the rain, the gutter, the settling of the logs. Then he said, "The estate needed managing." "Other estates need managing," she said. "You are good enough at your work that you would have had no difficulty finding another." "That is true." "So." He put down his pen. He looked at the fire, not at her. The firelight found the amber in his eyes and did something particular with it. "Lady Theodora, I think you know the answer to the question you are asking me, and I think we have both agreed, very recently, that we are not yet at the point of having that conversation." She had agreed to that, in the garden, 3 days ago. She had been the one to say it. "I did agree to that," she said. "Yes." "I may have been premature." The silence that followed this was of a different quality entirely from anything that had gone before. It had weight and texture. It had the particular warmth of something that has been compressed and is considering expansion. Nathaniel looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them looked away. Then from above them there was the sound of a door opening and a footstep in the corridor. Helena, probably, checking on the hour. And the moment resolved itself back into the room as it was. A library, a rainy afternoon, 2 people who had been working and had stopped. "I think," he said quietly, "that it would be better if we allowed that conversation its proper time and circumstance." "You are very careful," she said. "I have had to be," he said. There was no self-pity in it, just the fact, delivered plainly, and she felt it land in her chest with an accuracy that took her breath away. She turned back to the correspondence. She finished her replies. The rain continued until evening. Mr. Prentice arrived on the 5th day, which Theodora regarded as poor timing, and which Helena regarded privately and with precision as exactly what one might expect. He was a thin, dry man of middle age, the sort of man who wore correctness like armor, and whose eyes had the calculating quality of someone who had built a career on being useful to people with more power than himself. He arrived in a rain carriage, which he clearly expected to signify something, and was received at the door by Nathaniel, which was apparently not what he had anticipated. Theodora did not come down immediately. She watched from the upper landing as Nathaniel spoke to Mr. Prentice in the hall below, not with hostility, which would have been both ungainly and unnecessary, but with the particular calm authority that was, she had always thought, one of his most effective qualities. He took up space very efficiently. He made rooms understand his position without any particular effort. She came downstairs when Nathaniel appeared at the foot of the stairs and looked up at her, which was its own form of communication. Mr. Prentice had a letter. He presented it to her in the small receiving room with the manner of a man delivering a legal document rather than a piece of paper, which was more or less what it was. Theodora read it standing because she had found over the last 6 months that she did most useful things better on her feet. The letter was from Geoffrey Rain, the current Viscount and his late brother's heir. It made a claim, carefully phrased in the language of collegial concern, that certain items of correspondence and documentation held at Pemberton Hall pertaining to the Rain estate's affairs had not been properly transferred at the time of the Duke's death. It expressed a hope that Lady Theodora would understand the sensitivity of the matter and assist in their recovery at her earliest convenience. She read it twice. Then she folded it precisely and held it. "Which items?" she said to Mr. Prentice specifically. He named 3. 2 were items she had never possessed. The third was a letter she had received from the Duke 6 months before his death, a private letter written in his own hand, in which he had expressed his intention to revise his will to include a modest settlement for her independent management. He had not lived to revise it. The letter was the only documentation she had of that intention, and it existed because she had placed it in the travelling desk that she had carried out of Rain House on the day of her departure. "I will require time to review the matter with my own solicitor," she said. Mr. Prentice produced the expression of a man who had expected this and had several prepared responses. He began the first of them. Theodora listened with the polite, unruffled attention she had developed to a very high standard during 2 years at Rain House, and when he had finished, she said, "I thank you for making the journey. I will be in contact within a fortnight." She did not move. He had no choice but to leave. Nathaniel was waiting in the corridor. He fell into step beside her without any preamble, which she found, in this particular moment, precisely correct. "You know what he wanted," she said. "I had a reasonable idea. Geoffrey Rain has been attempting to locate that letter since October." She stopped walking. "You knew about the letter? The Duke mentioned it to me when you visited the hall 2 years ago. He came down to look at the repairs to the mill race, and he mentioned in passing that he had written to you about his intentions for your provision. He was a private man, but he was not, I think, a dishonest one." She looked at him. She thought about the Duke, the decent, distant man who had puzzled her, and whom she had puzzled in return, and who had, in the last 6 months of his life, apparently been attempting to do right by her in the only terms available to him. She felt something for this, something complicated and mixed with a grief that was not quite grief for him, but for the proximity of something better that had almost happened. "He was not dishonest," she said. "He was unhappy. I think we both were, and neither of us was very good at naming it." "No," Nathaniel said. He was watching her with great care. "The letter is mine," she said. "Whatever Prentice implies, it is mine, and I have read enough of my father's estate correspondence to know when a legal claim is substantial and when it is an attempt at intimidation. It is the latter." "I know." She began walking again. He kept pace. The corridor was cool and smelled of the beeswax Mrs. Goodall applied to the floors twice a week, and the afternoon light came through the landing window at the far end and made a long rectangle of pale gold on the boards. "I am going to write to the solicitor in the village," she said. "This afternoon. I will give you his direction if you have lost it." "I have not lost it." She paused. "Thank you for being there when he arrived." "There was nothing to thank me for." "There was." She looked at him directly. "I am thanking you for it." He held her gaze for a moment. His expression was even and steady and gave very little away, but there was something in it, something warm and careful and entirely his, and she thought for the first time with any clarity that being angry at the people who had separated them was not a thing she wanted to spend much more of herself on. She went to write the letter. She could not sleep. This was not new. Since the removal from Rain House, she had developed an irregular relationship with sleep, some nights adequate, most nights not, her mind doing what minds do when the life around them has been unsettled, cataloguing and reassessing and producing, at 3 in the morning, long careful lists of things that needed to be thought about but which could not actually be resolved at 3 in the morning. Pemberton Hall at night was very quiet. The house had the specific silence of a well-built old building, the kind that had absorbed so many decades of ordinary life that it had developed its own acoustic quality, different from the silence of an empty house and different from the silence of a full one. It breathed in its way. She had grown up with that breathing and found it now unexpectedly comforting. She took a candle from the mantelpiece and went down to the library. Nathaniel was there. He was not at the main table, but at the smaller writing desk in the alcove by the far window, and he was writing something by lamplight. The rest of the room was in the dim, warm country of candlelight, and the fire had been built down to coals. He heard her come in and looked up without startling. "I could not sleep," she said, which was an explanation rather than an apology. "Nor I." He put down his pen. "There is still tea in the pot from earlier, if it has not gone entirely cold." She checked. It had not entirely. She poured a cup and brought it to the chair near the fire rather than the table, and he left his desk and came to the chair across from her, and they sat in the half-light with the coals going red and the candles making small, unsteady shapes on the ceiling. "What are you writing?" she asked. "A letter to the timber merchant in Bath," he said, "since you declined him this afternoon." "I thought you were going to decline him." "I was, but your letter is better." She looked at him over her cup. He was not smiling quite, but something in his face was. "How do you know? You have not read it." "Have not." "I know how you write," he said. I have read your correspondence to the tenant farmers this afternoon, and the note you sent to the solicitor. You are concise, and you do not waste words, and you mean what you say, which is rarer than it should be." He paused. "I remember how you wrote before as well, the letters about the translation." The translation. She had not thought about those letters in years. They had been an extended correspondence about a passage in a French novel, a passage about what constitutes a reasonable expectation of happiness in a life that is mostly reasonable, without being quite what one had hoped for. The argument had lasted 4 months and had never been resolved, and had not really been about the translation. "I remember those letters," she said. "So do I." The coals shifted and fell together. The room rearranged its light accordingly. Nathaniel. She had not used his name directly in 3 years. It felt like testing ice, pressing a foot down carefully to see whether it held. "I would like to talk about what happened. Not everything, not all at once. But I would like to stop talking around it quite so carefully." He was quiet for a moment, not weighing whether to speak. He had already decided that, but choosing with care where to begin. "I should have spoken before," he said, "before the engagement. I knew what your father was planning or had some sense of it, and I did not speak. I told myself it was not my place, that I had no standing to say anything, that what you felt, what we both felt, I had no right to name something that had never been named." "I would have wanted you to name it," she said. "I know that now." He looked at the fire. "I think I knew it then. But being correct about it after the fact is not the same as having had the courage for it at the time." She set her cup down. The night outside was very still. No rain now, no wind, just the April dark pressing quietly against the old windows. "You stayed," she said. "Yes. For 3 years. Yes. I want to understand that." He turned to look at her, the way he had always looked at her, the way of someone who was not performing attention but actually paying it. "I think you do understand it," he said. "I think you have understood it since you came through the gate." She had. She had understood it with the clarity of something she had been told in a language she had not known she still spoke fluently. She had understood it, and she had been walking around it very carefully for 6 days. "My father is dying," she said, "and there are things I need to sort out with the solicitor and the Rain estate, and none of this is a good time for—" "No," he agreed. "It is not. But I find I am thinking about it regardless." "So am I," he said. "I have been thinking about very little else for 6 days, in fact, which is not particularly conducive to estate management." She looked at him for a long moment in the firelit room, in the quiet old house in the middle of the night, and she felt something very simple and very large, the feeling of being in the right room and knowing it. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Lady Theodora," he said. She went back to bed. She slept. She was woken at 3:30 on the 7th morning by Helena, who came in without knocking and said, in the voice she used for things that could not wait, "Your father." The next 20 minutes were the particular formless urgency of medical crisis at night. The quick, cold walk through dark corridors, the smell of the sick room changed and sharper, Dr. Finch already there or arriving moments after. The sound of her father's breathing wrong in the way that things which should be rhythmic become wrong when the rhythm fails. She stood at the foot of the bed and listened to Dr. Finch, and answered his questions in clear sentences, because her father needed that from her right now, not the other thing that was happening in her chest, which was a species of fear she had not examined in advance and was not going to examine now. She did not know how Nathaniel came to be there. She did not notice him arrive. At some point in the middle of it all, after the physician's initial assessment and during the interval when they were waiting to see whether the crisis would peak and resolve or continue, she became aware that he was in the room, standing near the door at the far end of the bed, in the way of someone who was there to be useful and was waiting to know in what specific direction his usefulness should go. She did not look at him. She sat beside her father and held his hand and spoke to him very quietly, in the way she had discovered over the last 7 days that he seemed to find steadying, simply talking in a low and even voice about practical things. The estate, the beech woods, the kitchen garden, the timber merchant from Bath. She was not certain how much of it he heard in the moments when his breathing was worst. She continued regardless. The crisis peaked at around 4 and began to ease at 4:45. Dr. Finch let out a breath and said in his measured way that the worst had passed and that rest was now the best medicine and that he would return in the morning and that they might consider engaging a night nurse for the duration. She sat with her father until the light changed, the very first pale grey of dawn coming through the curtain gap, so faint as to be almost imagined. His breathing was slow and shallow, but regular again. His hand in hers was warm. When she finally rose and came out of the room, closing the door softly behind her, Nathaniel was in the corridor. He had not left. He was sitting on the wooden chair that stood beside the linen press, the chair that had always been there for exactly this kind of vigil, she realized, the chair where people sat when they could not leave and had nowhere else to be. She stood in the corridor in the early grey light and looked at him, and said nothing, and he said nothing, and this particular silence was of a kind that required no content whatsoever, because it was itself the content. "He is stable," she said finally. "I know. I could tell from the sounds." She leaned her back against the wall beside the door. The plaster was cool through her dressing gown. She was very tired, and something in her chest had been shaken loose by the last 2 hours in a way that she could feel, like a stone that has shifted and has not yet settled. "I thought," she began and stopped. "I know," he said quietly. "I have been pretending it is not as serious as it is," she said. "I have been very efficient and practical about it. It is easier to be efficient." "Yes," he said, "it is." "He is still my father," she said. "Whatever he did, he is still my father, and I am not ready." Nathaniel was quiet. Then he said, "You do not have to be ready. There is nothing about this that requires you to be ready for it." She pressed her hands against the cool wall behind her. The grey light in the corridor was growing slowly. A robin had started somewhere in the garden, very early and very certain, as though it had decided opinions about the morning and intended to share them. "You should sleep," she said. "I will when you do." "That is not necessary." "No," he agreed. "It is not." She looked at him for a moment, at the tiredness in his face, the dark amber of his eyes in the low light, the set of his shoulders that had been ready for hours to be useful in whatever way was required. He had sat in the corridor all night because she was on the other side of a door and he would not leave. She understood this completely. "Nathaniel," she said, "thank you." He nodded. Just once. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the robin going about its urgent business in the garden, and she thought about all the ways a person can be present in another person's life without occupying any of the official roles that presence is usually given. Then she lay down and slept, and dreamed of nothing, and woke at 10:30 to find that her father's condition had improved, and that Helena had let her sleep through breakfast and did not feel the slightest need to apologize for it. Her father's improvement over the following 2 days was the careful incremental kind that Dr. Finch described as encouraging but not conclusive, a phrase that contained its own honesty she appreciated. He sat up longer. He ate a little. He asked Nathaniel for a report on the progress of the East Cottage repairs, with the specificity of a man who had not lost interest in his estate despite losing the capacity to walk through it, and Nathaniel gave him one with equal specificity, and she sat in the corner of the room and watched the two of them, and thought about things she had been putting off thinking about. That evening after supper, she found Nathaniel in the small sitting room where the household accounts were kept. He was reconciling the monthly ledgers with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, not performing patience, but simply having it. She came in and sat down across from him. She did not bring any work. He looked up. He waited. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I have been working up to it for several days, which is uncharacteristically slow of me. Take whatever time you need." "I have had quite enough time," she said. "I think more time is not what I require." She folded her hands on the table. "I did not want to marry the Duke of Rain." "I know," he said. "I was obedient about it," she said. "I was obedient in the way of someone who has been told that this is what the situation requires, and who has not yet learned that obedience, in matters of this kind, has a cost that does not diminish over time. I was 23 and I did not know how to say no to my father in a way that had any structural support. I had been raised to understand my duty, and I understood it, and the understanding of it did not prevent me from knowing that I was doing something irreparable. He was very still. "I knew what I was leaving when I said yes," she said. "I knew on the morning of the engagement and on the day of the wedding, and every day for 2 years, with a clarity that was not particularly useful and which I spent considerable energy managing." She looked at him directly. "I thought you should know that it was not, that I was not—" She stopped. "That you were not indifferent," he said. "I was not remotely indifferent," she said. "I was as far from indifferent as it is possible to be while conducting oneself with complete correctness." He looked at her for a long moment. The candle on the ledger table was the only light in the room, a warm, contained circle that made the space feel smaller and more private than the room actually was. "The morning your engagement was announced," he said, "I was in the East Field when your father came to tell me. I had planned to speak that week. I had been composing what I intended to say for some time. I had it quite ordered in my mind." A pause. "The timing was not good on my part." "No," she said, "it was not. I should have spoken sooner." "Yes?" She did not let him take all of it. "And I should have told you what I was feeling instead of expecting you to speak first. I was waiting for you, and you were waiting for what you thought was the correct moment, and neither of us said anything. And that silence became the shape of 3 years. And what followed from it," he said. "And what followed from it," she agreed. The candle flame moved in some small current of air she could not identify. Outside the window, the evening was perfectly still, the sky that pale April dark that is almost not dark at all, the last of the light sitting in the western edge of things. "I am going to say the rest of this," she said, "and then you may say whatever you need to say or not say it, and we can both decide from there. Is that acceptable?" "Yes," he said. "I came here for my father," she said. "That is the truth. I came because he wrote that he was afraid, and I could not make myself not go to that. But I have been here 9 days, and my father is not the only thing I have been thinking about, and I think I have done enough of the thing where I do not say what I am thinking in order to preserve a form that no longer serves anyone." She looked at him. The candle between them put warmth along his jaw, found the amber of his eyes. "I do not know what is possible now. I do not know what you want, or whether it is anything like what I want, and I am not going to assume, because assuming in that direction has caused enough damage already. But I am telling you plainly that I have not, that what I felt before all of this, I have not been able to set it down." The room was very quiet. "You could not set it down," he said, "or you did not want to." She considered this honestly. "Both," she said. "But mainly the second." He looked at her across the candle-lit table, looked at her in the way that she had missed for 3 years without being able to name exactly what she was missing. And she felt it quite clearly now, the specific quality of being seen. "Theodora," he said. "Not Lady Theodora, just Theodora." She said, "I know." He spoke then. Not immediately. There was a pause, the length of something being decided, the careful pause of a man who had spent 5 years giving words his full consideration before releasing them and was not about to abandon that practice now. "I need to say this correctly," he said. "I have been saying it in my head for a considerable time, and I would rather say it once, well, than several times badly." "Take the time," she said. He took a breath. "When I came to Pemberton Hall 8 years ago, I was 23 and I had a great deal of professional competence and very little else. I had worked since I was 16, first in my father's practice in Bath and then with 2 other estates in the county, and I understood land and accounts and management, and I understood very little about anything that was not those things." He paused. "I met you in the library. You were 18. You were reading a French novel and you were deeply annoyed at it, which I found extremely interesting." She remembered this. She had been annoyed at the translation. She had said as much to the ceiling. She had not known he was in the room. "We argued about it," she said. "For 40 minutes, he said, "and I went back to my desk and could not concentrate on anything for the rest of the afternoon, which had not happened to me before." She felt something warm moving through her chest very carefully. I knew, he said, within the first year what I was beginning to feel, and I knew equally clearly that I had no standing to feel it in any direction that mattered. I am not an aristocrat. I am not a landed gentleman. I am a steward, a good one, but a steward. You were the daughter of an earl and my employer, and the distance between us was real. Whatever else was also real. It did not have to be insurmountable, she said. No, he said, it did not. But I did not know that then with any certainty, and so I was careful. More careful than I have ever been about anything, because the alternative was saying something that could not be unsaid, and I was afraid of what that might cost you. Not what it might cost you. That too, he said with a directness she appreciated. I am not going to claim it was entirely selfless. She almost smiled. I did not think it was. But the primary concern was you, he said. It was always you. When your father made the arrangement with the Rain family, I understood why he did it. I did not agree with it, but I understood. And I told myself that you would be well provided for, that the match was not without its merits, that perhaps what I felt was more limited than it seemed to me. And I believed none of it, he said. Not one word. But I did not stop saying it to myself for several months, on the grounds that persistence sometimes produces conviction. It did not. She looked at the candle flame. It had shortened a little. They had been talking for some time in this room in the evening, with the ledgers open and forgotten between them. You stayed, she said. I stayed, he agreed. The Northumberland position was genuine, entirely genuine. Very good terms, larger estate, better prospects. He said this without self-congratulation and without any trace of martyrdom, just facts laid out evenly. I read the offer letter twice. I told myself to accept it. I wrote a letter of acceptance, drafted it in full, a pause. I did not send it. Why not? He looked at her. The amber of his eyes in the candlelight was entirely steady. Because your father was here, he said. And because the last place where anything of what we had existed, any trace of it, any residue, was this house. And I was not ready to leave it, which was perhaps foolish of me. No, she said. And then I received your father's letter saying you were in Wiltshire, he said, and there was another Northumberland offer, and again I did not accept it, and I told myself that was the last time I would refuse a reasonable future for a past that might not be revisable. He paused. Then your father wrote that he was ill, and I knew he would write to you, and I found I could not leave. The room was very still. Theodora could feel the weight of what was being laid out in front of her. Not just the words, but the years behind them, the quietly enormous accumulation of a man staying in a place and refusing better things and waiting for something he was not certain would ever return. Nathaniel, she said. Her voice was entirely steady because she had decided that it would be. When you stayed, after the engagement, after the marriage, after all of it, did you know that I felt? Yes, he said, not with certainty, but I suspected. And the suspicion was enough. Enough to stay. Enough to stay, he said. She pressed her hands together on the table. Something in her chest was very full and very calm at the same time. The quality of emotion she associated with the resolution of things that have been unresolved for too long, the particular piece of attention that has finally been named. I did not set it down, she said again. 3 years of attempting to be reasonable about it, and I did not manage to set it down. No, he said. Neither did I. The next morning her father asked to see them both. Helena brought the message to Theodora at the breakfast table, and the form of it, both of you, the precise phrasing, which was unmistakably deliberate, made Theodora set down her coffee and look at the ceiling for a moment, and then nod. Nathaniel was already in the corridor outside the east bedroom when she arrived, and from the quality of his stillness, she gathered that he had received his own message separately and had understood its meaning as clearly as she had. Do you know what he wants? She asked. A reasonable guess, he said. So do I. They went in together. Her father was sitting up more than she had seen him sit since her arrival, 3 pillows instead of 4, his dressing gown neat, his colour better than yesterday, his pale green eyes alert and containing something she would have called, in another context, anticipation. On the bedside table she noticed a small object that had not been there before, a ring resting on a folded square of cloth, gold, set with a dark red stone, a design she recognized. Her mother's ring. Her mother had worn it on her right hand for all of Theodora's childhood, had removed it only when her hands became too thin in the last weeks of her illness. Theodora had not seen it since. Her father looked at both of them for a moment. She had the impression of being assessed, carefully and honestly, and without any attempt at pretense, by someone who was not going to have enough time left to afford pretense. "I asked you both here," he said, "because I have something to give, and it requires a witness, and it requires the right moment, and I have been watching for the right moment for several days." He paused, conserving breath. "I believe this is it." Neither she nor Nathaniel spoke. Her father's voice was thin but steady. "I made a mistake," he said, "that cost my daughter 3 years of her life and any number of things more difficult to measure. I cannot undo it. I have tried to understand it well enough to apologize for it, and I believe I have, in the private conversations we have been having this week, done what I can in that direction." He looked at Theodora. "You have been more generous with me than I deserved." "You are my father," she said. "I have not been generous. I have been honest." "The distinction," he said, "is smaller than you think." He reached for the ring on the bedside table. His hand was not entirely steady. The illness had done that to him, but he picked it up with a kind of concentrated deliberateness and held it. "This was your mother's," he said. "It was her mother's before that. It was given to her grandmother by a man who told her it was a promise ring, which is not precisely an engagement ring, but which has, in this family, served the same function." He looked from Theodora to Nathaniel. "It was my intention, when my daughter came of age, to give it to the man who was going to make her happy." No one spoke. "I gave it to no one," her father said, "because the man I arranged for her did not make her happy, could not have through no fault of his own, because she was already committed elsewhere in the way that matters most, and which I chose not to see." He turned the ring in his fingers once. "I am giving it now, late, inexcusably late. But I am giving it." He held it out to Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Theodora. She felt her throat tighten. She did not trust herself to speak, which was very unusual, and which she decided to allow rather than resist, because some moments should not be spoken through. Nathaniel looked at Arthur Pemberton. "You are certain," he said. Not quite a question, more the statement of a man who is going to proceed with something important and wishes to be sure of his ground. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," her father said, "which is a somewhat deflating thing to admit at the end of it, but there it is." Nathaniel took the ring. He held it, looking at it, the dark red stone catching the morning light coming through the curtain gap, the gold worn to a softness that only years of daily wear produces. He turned it in his fingers once. Then he turned to Theodora. She found she could meet his eyes. She found it very easy to meet his eyes. "I have not asked you," he said. "In all of this I have said what I needed to say and what was true, but I have not asked." "No," she said, "you have not." "May I ask now?" She breathed. The room was very still, her father on the pillows, the morning coming in pale and clear, the ring in Nathaniel's hand catching the light. She thought about 3 years, and a marriage that had not been what she wanted, and a cottage with draughty windows, and a letter that arrived on a Tuesday, and the gate where she had lost the power of her hands. She thought about a man who had read the offer letter from Northumberland twice, and not sent his acceptance. "You may ask," she said. He did not make a speech of it. He was not a man who would make a speech of it. He asked her plainly in one sentence, looking at her with those amber eyes that had never once looked at her with anything other than complete attention. She said yes. Her father leaned back against his pillows and closed his eyes, and the expression on his face was the closest thing to peace she had seen from him in years. They did not stay in the bedroom long after that. Her father was tired, the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after something important has been resolved, and Dr. Finch arrived at 10:30 and chased them both into the corridor with the mild authority of a man who has made a professional study of when people need to rest. Nathaniel and Theodora walked downstairs together, slowly, in the way of people who are carrying something new and are not in any particular hurry to arrive anywhere because arriving would mean having to decide what to do next, and they were not quite ready for next yet. They had had years of not quite ready. A few more minutes was not going to break anything. They came out through the south door into the garden. The April morning was clear and cold, with a sky so pale a blue that it was almost white at the edges, and the kind of sunlight that is bright without being warm, that makes shadows very sharp, and everything else very clean. The rose beds along the south wall were still dormant, but the earliest had put out a few tentative green shoots, and somewhere in the beech woods behind the house a woodpecker was working at a dead branch with great conviction. She was wearing her mother's ring on her right hand, which was where her mother had always worn it, and she was aware of it in the way of something newly acquired that has not yet settled into ordinary sensation. The stone was dark red in the sunlight, garnet or carnelian she had never been certain, and it was warm from being held, first by her father and then by Nathaniel, and then by her, each of them handling it with a care that had nothing to do with its monetary value. "Tell me something," she said. They were walking along the south wall, not to any destination, just walking. "The estate in Northumberland, what was it?" "Highmore," he said. "On the border, about 4,000 acres, primarily sheep." 4,000 acres. "And a house that needed considerable work." She glanced at him. "You would have been very good at it." "Probably," he said in the tone of someone who is not being modest, but is also not particularly interested in the hypothetical life that did not happen. "Do you regret not going?" He looked at her sideways. "I am walking in this garden in April, with your mother's ring on your hand," he said. "What do you think?" She felt something open in her chest, a quiet, expansive thing, the feeling of a room after the windows have been opened in the first warm weather. She had not had many moments of uncomplicated happiness in recent years. This was one of them, and she noted it with the care it deserved. "We will have to be practical," she said after a moment. "There are things to sort out. The Rain solicitor is not going to disappear, and my father's estate will need proper management when—" She stopped. "When the time comes," Nathaniel said. "Yes." She looked at the rose beds. "And there will be questions about the arrangement, about what it means for you professionally, and for me." "There will be questions," he agreed, "and we will answer them in their time, in the correct order." He paused. "You have a solicitor in the village?" "I do." "And the letter from the Duke?" "Yes." "Then the practical things have solutions," he said, "and the solutions will take time, and time is what we have." She considered this. It was a very practical thing to say. It was also a very true thing, and the combination of these two qualities was entirely characteristic of him. "You are very calm about all of this," she said. "I have been imagining it in various forms for approximately 5 years," he said. "I have had time to achieve calm. That is either very controlled of you or very romantic." "Almost certainly both," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were at the corner of the south wall where the garden opened into the wider grounds, and from here she could see the beech woods and the fields below them, and the long curve of the lane that ran to Ashton Cross, and the morning light lay across all of it, with the particular generosity of English spring at its best, the kind of light that makes the ordinary world look like a thing that was worth arriving at. "I am glad I came," she said. "Your father is glad you came." "Yes, but I meant—" She stopped and amended, "I came for my father, and I am glad I came for my father, and I am also—" She looked at the ring on her hand, then at him. "I am glad I came home." Nathaniel looked at her. The morning was very clear, and there was nothing between them now. No arrangement requiring management, no distance performing its function, no careful silence filling the space where words had been avoided for too long. Just a garden and 2 people standing in it, and the ring warm on her finger, and the woodpecker going at its branch in the beechwood with unshakable purpose. He took her hand. Not the ringed hand, the other one simply, with the directness and the absence of performance that was entirely his. His fingers were warm, and the grip was steady, and she held it. "Home," he said. Just the word. "Home," she agreed. The weeks that followed were not simple. Very little that is worth having is simple, and Theodora Pemberton had been given sufficient evidence of this over the preceding 3 years that she had stopped expecting otherwise. The Rain solicitor came twice more. The second time she received him with her own solicitor from Ashton Cross present, and with the Duke's letter laid out on the table before her, clear and legible, signed in his own hand, witnessed and dated 6 months before his death. Mr. Prentice looked at it for a long time. He made several observations. She responded to each of them with the calm precision of someone who had prepared for this conversation with considerable care and was not going to be moved by repetition. He went away. She did not expect him to come a third time, and he did not. The settlement was modest. It had only ever been a modest provision, the Duke having understood quite clearly that it was a gesture rather than a major restructuring of the estate. But it was enough to be independent, enough to have ground under her feet that was not borrowed or contingent. Her father improved by small and inconsistent degrees through the remainder of April. He sat up longer. He ate more. He asked Dr. Finch, with some asperity, whether he could be permitted to see the garden, and Dr. Finch said perhaps when the weather was reliably warmer, and her father said that the weather in England was never reliably warmer, and could he have a blanket and an hour in the sun, and Dr. Finch said he would consider it. He was carried to the garden on a fine Thursday in the first week of May, in a chair with wheels that Nathaniel had acquired with great practical efficiency, and which her father accepted without comment, because there are things a man accepts when the alternative is not seeing his garden. He sat in the warm patch of afternoon sun beside the south wall for an hour, with Theodora on one side, and the first open rose of the season, a small, very deep pink, technically an early bloomer and probably showing off, on the other. He did not speak much. He looked at the beech woods for a long time. He looked at the sky. He looked at Theodora. "Your mother would have liked him," he said. "Mama liked everyone," Theodora said. "Not everyone," her father said. "She had discrimination, but yes, she would have liked him." She thought her mother would have liked the way he moved through a room, quietly, purposefully, without requiring acknowledgement. She thought her mother would have liked the amber of his eyes, and the way he thought before he spoke, and the fact that when he was in the garden, he looked at it as though looking at something genuinely worth seeing. "I am glad," she said to her father. He patted her hand once. He died on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of May, with the sun coming through the east window and the smell of the rose beds drifting in on the warm air. It was peaceful, as these things go, the conclusion of something that had been releasing its hold for weeks. Dr. Finch said he had not suffered at the end. Theodora sat with him for a while after, in the quiet that follows these things and which has its own particular texture, and she was grateful, not without grief, not without the ache of all the time and the things that had not been said until too late, but genuinely grateful that she had come home when he asked her. There was a great deal to manage in the weeks that followed. The estate, the succession which went to a second cousin her father had met twice, who turned out to be a reasonable man and who had the good sense to ask Nathaniel to stay on as steward. The sorting of her father's rooms, which takes longer than expected and yields unexpected things. Her mother's letters in a box in the study, tied with a blue ribbon, which she did not open but kept. She did open one evening in June a small notebook she found in her father's desk drawer. It was a personal notebook, not an estate record, but a private one, the kind a man keeps for himself. On the last page, in the careful, cramped hand she had known all her life, were 4 lines. "I have been wrong about many things. I have been right about very few. Among the things I was right about, this house, this land, these beeches. Among the things I was wrong about, everything that kept her from being happy here. I hope she is happy here now. A." She read it once. She put it back. She went to find Nathaniel, who was in the library, and she told him what it said. And he was quiet for a moment, and then said something that was both practical and kind, which was his way, and which was exactly what she needed. They were married in October, in the church in Ashton Cross in the early morning light with the beech woods turning gold around the village. There was no great occasion of it. Her father was gone, and she had no interest in the performance of social ceremony for its own sake, and neither did he. There was Mrs. Goodall, who wept quietly and with great dignity. There was Helena, who did not cry and looked extremely satisfied. There was Dr. Finch, who had been attending the Pemberton household for 11 years, and who accepted the invitation with the warmth of someone who had watched a great deal of this story unfold and was glad to see its conclusion. She wore her mother's ring on her right hand, as she had been wearing it since April. She put a plain gold band on her left hand in the church, and Nathaniel put his hands around hers for a moment after, and she felt the weight of both rings and was very still and did not look away from him. They walked back to the hall from the church through the beechwood lane, because the morning was clear and they were in no hurry, and the lane was beautiful, which it always was in October, the leaves coming down in the light wind, copper and amber and pale gold, settling on the road and on their shoulders and on the ground around them, like something being deliberately, carefully released. She had thought, when she packed her trunks in the cottage in March and told Helena to begin, that she was returning for her father. She had been right about that. But she understood now, walking through the beeches in October, with the leaves falling and his hand in hers, that she had also, without knowing it, been returning for herself, for the self that had existed in this house before she had learned to be careful and obedient and accommodating, for the woman who had argued about translations in the library and walked through this wood in all its seasons and known at 20 years old, with a clarity she had not given herself permission to trust, exactly what kind of life she wanted. She was 31 now. He was 35. She thought sometimes about the years between them, but only in the way one thinks about a long winter, acknowledging its length without lingering resentment, because the winter was over, and the spring that had followed it when it finally came had been extravagant in everything. This is what became of Theodora Pemberton, who was cast out and returned, who came home for one reason and stayed for better ones, who said yes to the wrong man in the correct order of wrong things that led, eventually, to the right answer, whose father left her a garden, a house, a ring, and 4 lines in a notebook that she kept on the shelf beside her mother's letters and read whenever she needed reminding that people are occasionally capable of knowing what they got wrong, who walked through the beech woods in October with a plain gold ring and a promise ring garnet, and a man whose hands were warm and whose eyes had the particular amber that October light finds best, and who did not look back down the lane, because there was nothing behind her now that was worth more than what was ahead. Every Duchess has a story the world forgot to ask about.